Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all here. My name is Mark Winfield. I'm an associate professor of environmental studies at York University, and I'm also co-chair of the Sustainable Energy Initiative at the faculty, which is our vehicle for integrating our teaching and research and partnership activities around sustainable energy issues. I want to thank everybody who's here and also those who are joining us in cyberspace. I understand we have folks in Montreal, Ottawa, Waterloo, a number of other locations who are watching online as well as here in the room. I want to thank Osgood Professional Development for helping us host this. The event is actually funded through a project supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council that we're undertaking with partners at Carleton and the University of Waterloo, called Unlocking the Potential for Smart Grids, and this is one of the dimensions, the jurisdictional interconnections that we want to explore through that project. And I also want to thank SEI's coordinator, Tanya Roberts, who's at the back of the room. Everybody, I think, will have been in touch with her. And it's with very mixed feelings, I have to say that this is Tanya's last activity and undertaking for SEI. She has taken on the position of sustainability coordinator at Durham College, so an enormous loss for us, but a huge gain for Durham College. So I want to convey some greetings on behalf of our Dean, Noel Sturgeon, who could not be here this morning. And just a reminder that this event is part of the ongoing SEI seminar series on current energy and electricity issues in Ontario and in Canada and internationally. So a bit of background on why we're here, that Ontario has substantial interconnections with all of the jurisdictions that it neighbors with. Indeed, capacity in excess of 6,000 megawatts, the most substantial connections being with Quebec, something approaching 3,000 megawatts capacity. But to date, those interconnections have only been used for contingencies, not for firm supply arrangements. Number of sort of changing factors in the economic, technological, political landscape in both provinces have put the concept, the possibility of a more substantial relationship between the two in terms of electricity on the table. In Ontario, increasing presence of intermittent renewables as a result of the Green Energy Act and other initiatives has highlighted the need for storage to balance intermittency. And there is also an interest in potential alternatives to what could be potentially expensive and risky nuclear refurbishment projects. On the Quebec side, there has been a weakening of the traditional U.S. export market due to the availability of fracked gas, and that has somewhat displaced hydroelectric supply in the Northeast as the marginal supply for U.S. systems. There is at times in Quebec as well moments of surplus. And there are also some larger questions coming onto the table about the future of Hydro-Quebec. That said, this concept has drawn far more attention on the Ontario side than the Quebec side so far, and indeed it has been endorsed with varying degrees of enthusiasm by all four of the major parties in the Ontario elections. This is something that's very much come on to the political agenda. It's drawn less attention in Quebec, although that may be changing, and that sort of prompted us to bring together three speakers who could inform us a little bit more about both the possibilities and opportunities around a different relationship between Ontario and Quebec around electricity, but also some of the potential complications as well that might lie ahead. And to do this, we brought together three esteemed speakers. The first is well known to many people in Ontario, Jack Gibbons, who is the chair of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, and has been that since its founding. I was happy to say that I was there at the founding moment at CLAP in 1997, and I must admit we had no idea at the time how far this could go. Just an aside, in the last couple of weeks I was asked, along with a number of other people, to sort of come up with a list of the 10 most significant environmental achievements in Canada over the past 30 years, things that had actually resulted in measurable improvements in environmental quality and Interestingly, a number of people were coming up with these lists, and on almost all of them, somewhere on that list of top 10 was the coal phase out in Ontario, along with things like acid rain control in eastern Canada, cleanup of the Great Lakes, phase out of ozone depleting substances. So really quite an incredible achievement. And indeed, Jack has not been resting on his laurels. He, in fact, has been one of the principal proponents of the concept of some sort of new relationship between Ontario and Quebec around electricity. His background is in economics, degrees from the University of Toronto and Queens, and also studied at the University of British Columbia. When we began a few months ago to talk to our contacts in the energy world in Quebec to find out who would be the best person on the Quebec side to speak to this issue, all roads led back to Pierre-Olivier Pinault. Everybody we talked to said, Pierre is the person that you need to talk to and who needs to address this issue. He is a professor at the Department of Management Science at the HEC in Montreal and holds the chair in has held the chair in energy sector management since December 2013. He's an energy policy and management specialist with a focus on electricity reforms. His research focuses on electricity market integration and on optimal approaches to balance energy production and consumption. Our third speaker is Jack Burkham, and we invited Jack to join us because Brookfield Power, he's vice president with Brookfield Power, senior vice president for commercial development, and Brookfield participates in electricity markets in Ontario, Quebec, New York, throughout the region, and all of which would potentially be affected and by a new arrangement between Ontario and Quebec. We felt that given those engagements, that he could provide some very, very valuable perspectives on both the opportunities and potential complications associated with this path. In terms of our process today, we're going to have our three speakers speak first. So I'm going to ask people to hold their questions. We'll ask Jack Gibbons to speak first, and then Professor Pinault, and then Jack Burkham. Each speaker will sort of make some opening remarks for about 15 or 20 minutes. We're going to hold questions until the second half. We'll have about an hour for question and answer and discussion. And for those who are watching online, we do have the facility to take questions by email from those who are joining us in cyberspace as opposed to the analog version of this presentation. So with that, I'm going to ask Jack Gibbons to start, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your kind and generous introduction, and thank you for organizing this great conference. So it's great as an economist, it's great to have the opportunity to talk with you this morning about the benefits of importing clean, low-cost, reliable water power from the province of Quebec. And I'd like to begin by noting some important facts about Quebec. First, Quebec is the fourth largest producer of water power in the world. Second, Quebec has some of the lowest electricity rates in North America. Their residential rates are 45% lower than ours, and their industrial rates are 55% lower than ours. In addition, Quebec has a large and growing surplus of power for export. Since 2008, their electricity exports have increased by 50%. And most of these exports are to the United States, and most of these exports are pursuant to short-term contracts. Over 90% of their exports are pursuant to short-term contracts. But unfortunately for Quebec, its rising electricity exports have been accompanied by falling export prices. In 2008, the average price of their exports was 9 cents a kilowatt hour. Last year, it had fallen to 4.7 cents a kilowatt hour. And the falling prices are simply due to the fact, due to the shale gas revolution in the United States, which is pushing down the price of natural gas-fired generation in the U.S. Northeast. Now, I've quoted to you these average annual export prices, But the average annual prices mask the fact that there are in fact two different export markets that Hydro-Quebec faces. According to the Quebec Energy Commission, Hydro-Quebec can now only obtain high prices for their exports during the 300 peak demand hours of the year. During those 300 peak demand hours of the year, Hydro-Quebec can earn high export prices. So that's 300 hours of the year. But there's another problem for Hydro-Quebec. Not only can they only earn the high export prices during the 300 peak demand hours of the year, but because of transmission constraints, there's a limited amount of power they can actually export during these high price periods. And in fact, it's limited at 10 terawatt hours a year. And therefore, for the remaining 97% of the year, they're exporting power at much lower prices. According to the Quebec Energy Commission, at 3 cents a kilowatt hour for 97% of the year. A very low-priced electricity exports. And according to the Quebec Energy Commission, Hydro-Quebec's supply of these low-cost, low-price exports is going to increase by 50% over the next 6 years. So there's going to be a 50% increase by 2020 in Hydro-Quebec's supply of exports that are sold at a price of 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's the Quebec situation. Now let's turn to Ontario. And Ontario is a fascinating case study in economic irrationality. In Ontario, despite the fact that we live right next door to the fourth largest producer of water power in the world, we have had a policy in this great province, we've had a policy for over 100 years to simply refuse to enter into a long-term contract with the province of Quebec for electricity supply. We simply have refused to enter into a long-term electricity supply contract with Quebec for renewable, low-cost water power. That's been a policy for 100 years in this province. Now, on the other hand, Ontario, we are very happy to import virtually all of our natural gas from Western Canada and Pennsylvania. We have no problem with that. And we are very happy to import 100% of our uranium from Saskatchewan. But when it comes to low-cost, clean water power, we are electricity separatists. We are electricity separatists. We absolutely refuse to enter into a long-term contract with the province of Quebec. Now, as a result of our policy of electricity separatism, Ontario Power Generation, or OPG, is now seeking permission from the Ontario Energy Board to raise their rates by 30% to start paying for the rebuilding of their Darlington nuclear station. Now, according to OPG, this $13 billion project will produce electricity at a cost of 8.3 cents per kilowatt hour. 8.3 cents per kilowatt hour. Now I ask you, does it make sense? Does it make sense to rebuild Darlington at 8.3 cents per kilowatt hour when Quebec is exporting most of their electricity to the U.S. at 3 cents a kilowatt hour? Well, to ask the question is to answer it. It simply does not make economic sense. And the good news is that we have lots of transmission intertie capacity with Quebec. And just with our existing transmission capacity, we can import on an annual basis enough power from Quebec that is equivalent to 97% of the annual output of the Darlington nuclear station. So that means that Canada has the opportunity to save $1.2 billion a year by cancelling the Darlington rebuild project and increasing east-west electricity trade between Quebec and Ontario. Canada can save $1.2 billion a year. And if we were to split this $1.2 billion savings on a 50-50 basis between our two provinces, then each province would be richer by $600 million a year. each province will be richer by $600 million a year. And over a 20-year contract term, that means a net economic gain for each province of $12 billion. This is a lot of money sitting on the table, ready to be grabbed by economically rational actors. Now to achieve this 50-50 split of the $1.2 billion savings, we would need to negotiate a long-term contract with an initial starting price of 5.7 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's very interesting because the 5.7 cents a kilowatt hour initial starting price is virtually identical to the initial starting price of the long-term electricity supply contract between Quebec and Vermont. In 2010, Quebec signed a 26-year contract with Vermont for electricity supply. The initial starting price was 5.8 cents per kilowatt hour. And the price is reset every year based on regional electricity prices, but also with a mechanism that severely limits Vermont's exposure to electricity price spikes or sustained high price periods. So that's a great contract that Vermont and Quebec negotiated, and it's a contract that could serve as a starting point for negotiations between Ontario and Quebec. Now, I've told you that the economic savings to Canada of cancelling Darlington and importing water power from Quebec are at least $1.2 billion a year. But I want to emphasize that the actual savings are likely to be much greater than $1.2 billion a year. And that's for at least two reasons. First, our calculation of a $1.2 billion savings is based on the assumption that OPG could actually rebuild Darlington at 8.3 cents per kilowatt hour. And quite frankly, that estimate is not credible. Because as we all know, Ontario's nuclear industry has never been able to complete a major nuclear project on time or on budget. On average, our nuclear projects go over budget by an average of 2.5 times. So actually, that means that the savings of cancelling Darlington are likely to be much greater than $1.2 billion. And the other reason why our savings estimate is low, is conservative, is because we've assumed there will be no increase in transmission capacity between our two provinces. But clearly we all know that transmission capacity can be increased. And in this context, it is important to remember or to note the following facts. Quebec's electricity consumption per person is the highest in the world. The highest in the world. Quebec's electricity consumption per person is double that of Ontario. So that means that Hydro-Quebec, by investing in energy efficiency, has the opportunity to lower its domestic customers' bills and to free up more of its existing heritage hydroelectric capacity for profitable export sales to Ontario. So that's the second reason why the actual savings could be much greater than $1.2 billion a year. And now I'd like to turn to politics. And the good news is that it now appears that public support for political and electricity separatism appears to be falling. It appears to be falling dramatically. Last month, our friends in Quebec elected a very pro-Canada provincial government. And here in Ontario, the NDP and the Green Party are calling on the government of Ontario to negotiate a long-term electricity supply contract with Quebec to lower our electricity bills by up to $1 billion a year or more. And our Premier, Kathleen Wynne, has endorsed in principle the idea of a long-term electricity supply contract with Quebec. And opposition leader Tim Hudak has endorsed hydro imports from Quebec as required. So it appears that after the June 12th provincial election, the premiers of Ontario and Quebec will have the opportunity to sign a long-term electricity contract which will transform our power systems. By integrating our two electricity systems, our premiers have the opportunity to lower our energy bills and to make Ontario and Quebec once again the economic powerhouses of Confederation. Thank you for your attention.
Our second speaker is Pierre-Olivier Pinault from HEC in Montreal.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry my voice is not as normal as I would like it to be. I have a cold, so I'm a little bit sick. So don't shake my hand. I shook hand with a few people this morning. Maybe I shouldn't have. So if I want to shake your hand, say no. So I'll basically continue on the line that Jack Gibbons started. I think there's another projector that can be opened up. Well, anyway, yeah. And I'm really, my research is really based on electricity market integration. I finished my PhD in Finland in 98, 99, and the Nordic countries that I will talk a little bit about are the model I think Canada should follow. So basically, my talk will broaden the perspective on what Jack has mentioned and also focus on Quebec and the Quebec situation. I think there are great benefits, but there are great obstacles, and we should be aware from the Quebec perspective, the situation is totally different. So what I'm hoping to do this morning with you is to provide you with a broader Canadian perspective, something that we totally miss in electricity policy, and then go back from the Quebec perspective so that you could better understand what's the perspective in Quebec and the many obstacles that will have to be faced. So I think, as the title of this event suggests, it's time for a new relationship, but it's really time for a new relationship in Canadian electricity market, not only between Quebec and Ontario, but between Canadian provinces. Then we'll move to the Quebec perspective, and we'll look at the way forward. So that's the slide I probably like the most and tells the most also about Canadian electricity market. So here you can see the 10 provinces, and on the x-axis you can see the average industrial price across the 10 provinces, and on the y-axis you can see the average consumption, per capita consumption of the province. And you can see Quebec is on the top left situation, the lowest rates, the highest consumption, as Jack just mentioned. And Ontario is exactly at the opposite end of the graph, the highest rate and the lowest consumption. So you cannot find two more opposed provinces in terms of description of their electricity consumption and market. And if you think of it, can you think of another commodity or any product which has a price differential as great as this one in Canada or in the universe? Between two countries, you cannot think of the same thing that is sold just you cross the border at Ottawa, Gatineau, and then you pay almost twice the price for the same product. That wouldn't be accepted for gasoline. You know, we regularly see a newspaper article on gasoline prices, or when the dollar, the value of the Canadian dollar rises, people complain that the prices are still as expensive more expensive in Canada than in the US, where the people say they should be equal. People complain about all that, but I've never heard the public complaining about the fact that for the same thing, we pay prices as different across Canada for this. And of course, this leads to a situation in Quebec where we just use electricity for things that no one should use electricity for. Heating your home, heating your water, heating your garage pathway, heating your spa, heating your pool, swimming pool. So we use tons of electricity that is so cheap that people always complain about the price, because don't worry, Quebec people complain about the price of electricity because we always complain about the price. But when you ask them how much they spend on electricity, they don't know. And if you tell them that the average Quebecer spends more on tobacco and alcohol than electricity, they say, oh, really? And which is the truth. We spend more on alcohol and tobacco than electricity in Quebec. So this has to be rethought, especially since there's a great cost for Quebec. Selling electricity at such a low price is absurd. It doesn't make sense. It's a great economic opportunity cost. It's billions of dollars that basically Quebec should make. And with the impact of, if prices were changing in Quebec, basically what Jack Gibbons has described as improving energy efficiency in Quebec would happen because people would react to prices, lower their consumption. That would free a lot of terawatt hours for export. And that is one of the great benefits that electricity market integration would lead to. So the absurd situation we have across Canada is definitely not, specific to Quebec and Ontario. Here you have the Muskrat Falls project that Newfoundland and Labrador is planning to do, and basically it's actually funded by all of us. Partly the transmission line that is going all through Newfoundland to Nova Scotia will be partly funded by Canadian taxpayers, because it has federal support. So the great news about that project is that the federal government is willing to support interconnections and transmission links between provinces. So that's a great news, because if Quebec and Ontario were coming with a project, then there would be a precedent. Look at that absurd transmission line that will be there. There's a much less absurd transmission connection that would tie the two biggest provinces of Canada. So let's go for it. Let's finance it. That would be, in the way of some kind of Canadian electricity and energy policy and framework that everyone is actually looking toward. So that project is going on, although, as it's been mentioned already, that power prices are falling. The cost of Muskrat Fall is actually relatively high compared to other projects. You see La Romaine here, that is that is here, which is very close to Muskrat Falls and Gull Island. And there's been talks in the past to bundle these projects and have a more rational approach to this project. These talks just fell apart. As most of the talks between provinces in electricity fall apart. But things are happening. We can work towards more sense and more economic rationality in these projects. Well, the price differential, I won't spend long on this, but here you see in Ontario, residential consumers, they pay close to 14 cents. You pay close to 14 cents. Or around 14 cents, depending on your distributor and contract, for your electricity on average. In Quebec, I pay on average 7.2 cents, which is less than the actual real cost of supply of electricity, because on top of having a low-cost supply of electricity, residential consumers are subsidized by industrial consumers, and that lowers our rates. So, of course, the Quebec electricity policy has to be improved, and we should stop subsidizing residential consumers to lower their already low electricity costs. But there's about a 6 cents price differential, and it's mostly explained by the energy component. Energy and, of course, the cost of power plants. So that's why not refurbishing some nuclear power plants would make a lot of sense, because that wouldn't lock Ontario into huge long-term contracts that cannot be broken, because your nuclear power plant will be there for a long time. So what we have to really, what explains the low cost in Quebec is the cheap hydropower cost. So on average, Hydro-Quebec, the average supply cost is 2.09 cents per kilowatt hour. That's how much Hydro-Quebec production pays on average for its supply. And that's mostly related to the huge hydropower in Quebec that is coming at a very low cost. And also, I have to mention, because it is significant, it's also linked to Churchill Falls, a long-term contract. We receive about 30 terawatt hour in Quebec at 0.25 cents per kilowatt hour. So a quarter of a cent supply from Labrador to Quebec. So that, of course, helps getting that average supply cost of 2 cents. and that is then resold to Quebecers at 3 cents. Before you add transmission and distribution costs, then that's the cost, 2 cents. Hydro-Quebec makes an additional profit of 1 cent, and I pay as a consumer about 3 cents for the energy before transmission and distribution. Of course, there's a huge opportunity cost. If that electricity was sold to Ontario or New England from a Quebec's perspective, or New York, at the market rate, even if the market rate is only 4 cents the kilowatt hour, it would still be more than the 3 cents at which Hydro-Quebec is selling to Quebec consumers that energy. And we have this thing in North America that's called native load commitment. Basically, that is what locks Hydro-Quebec and mandates Hydro-Quebec to sell to Quebec consumers. The load, the Quebec load, has to be served first at whatever regulated price is set. And only if there are surpluses, then Hydro-Quebec is allowed to export. There's the native load commitment that has to be served at that low regulated price. It doesn't make any economic sense. A few years ago, I was not even a teenager at that time. There was the National Energy Program that people in the West, especially in Alberta, didn't like much. And why they didn't like this program? It's because basically Canadian oil had to be sold to Canadians at more or less the production cost and not at the market price of the world market price of oil. That program lasted 4 years. In electricity in Quebec and other provinces, Manitoba, British Columbia, that provincial electricity program is still lasting since the beginning or for the last 50 or 60 years. We are selling to ourselves at the low regulated rates when there's the market price that is above that regulated rate everywhere. So there was much fury against the National Energy Program. No one is questioning the provincial electricity program that are basically these native load commitments that basically oblige Hydro-Quebec to sell to Quebec consumers at these low prices instead of selling to other ones. So that doesn't make sense. It's bad for Quebec because basically there's a huge opportunity cost in not selling at the right price, and there's a huge cost for Ontario and neighbors that basically makes you, compels you to build expensive facilities to produce electricity. That is a huge problem, economic problem that could inject billions of dollars in the Canadian economy. That is not specific to Quebec and Ontario. Manitoba is in exactly the same situation as in Quebec, and British Columbia also. These three provinces, they share almost the exact same structure in terms of price, organization of the electricity market. They don't produce, BC and Manitoba don't produce as much hydro as Hydro-Quebec, but they do still produce a lot of hydro that they sell at these low rates, and doesn't make more sense in the West than in Canada, in Quebec, I mean. So basically, the inspiration I'm always pushing for is the Nord Pool, which is the only international electricity market, free market across countries. So here you have Norway, which is, by the way, a huge hydro producer and the leader of that integrated market. In 92 or 94, they decided basically to sell electricity at the market rate. First in Norway, then Sweden joined, then Finland joined, then Denmark joined, then the Baltic country partly joined. Then they are building interconnections with Germany, with the Netherlands, with the UK. And maybe you can see, but here it's a snapshot of their website, almost the equivalent of your IESO, where you can see the market price by regions, and it's the same, almost the same across all the regions. 25 euros per megawatt hours from Finland to Norway. Basically, that's the price, the energy component price that everyone is paying in these Nordic countries. And there are states, so they're not even provinces of the same country. They are different states. They have different laws. They're all sovereign, but they were wise enough to basically realize that trade is a good thing. And not only do they trade, but they tax a lot their electricity, which I think would be a good thing, at least from the Quebec perspective, to tax it more. And then we have prices in Norway which are as high as 17 cents per kilowatt hour, and half of that is for taxes. But so you have energy market price and then and then taxes. And that's good for the economy because that money doesn't disappear. It goes and funds what we should do. So it promotes energy efficiency, and then you can reinvest this money in many different things. We'll have to move towards such a model. You know, if Newfoundland and Labrador is to build more than Muskrat Falls, but they want to build Gull Island, which is more than 2,000 megawatt of new capacity that they want to build. And these slides are just stolen or taken from Nalcor Energy. So that's their own plan. They cannot think, even themselves, even with subsidies from the federal government, they cannot think of transmission lines large enough to carry the Gull Island energy. So they would have to go through Quebec. And so they will have to negotiate with Quebec. And if that happens in a Canadian framework, that would be much easier for everyone. And that energy, if it goes to Quebec, then of course it could go to Ontario. That's more than 2,000 megawatt that can be built. And there's La Romaine also that could be built, that is actually being built. That could supply lots of energy and could replace some of the nuclear power plants that you have in Ontario. So the Quebec's perspective. So in Quebec, as in other provinces, we are inward looking when it comes to electricity. So Jack was really hard on Ontarians, and I think he was too hard. Every province is thinking in terms of electricity separatism. We're only looking at, our specific, as if the political borders were relevant when we talk energy or the environment. Political borders don't make sense when you talk about energy markets, environmental markets. These commodities should be traded and thought about in a more global perspective. But with people in Quebec think there is a surplus, so that's the slide stolen from Hydro-Quebec distribution. Basically, you see the green line, which is the supply contracts that Hydro-Quebec distribution has already signed with different contractors and electricity producers, mostly Hydro-Quebec production, but there's still a contract between Hydro-Quebec production and distribution. So distribution is buying power, and you see the blue line. These are the anticipated demand for the next 15 years. So basically, consistently, Hydro-Quebec distribution, which is the largest by far supplier of electricity, has over-contracted electricity by 2 to 5 terawatt hour above its needs, its forecasted needs for the next 15 years. So that makes, and then La Romaine will come progressively in production by 2020. So that would give instantaneously 10 to 15 terawatt hour of available electricity in Quebec. That could not replace all of Ontario's nuclear power production, but, for a few power plants, nuclear power plants, there would be immediate replacement available. So people in Quebec say this is a disaster. What are we going to do with these surpluses? Export prices are low, and there's a lot of pessimism in Quebec about that. I'm actually extremely optimistic, and January and February proved me right, at least for 2 months as we're right. And these are the price. So when in Quebec, people were saying that the export price, as Jack Gibbons mentioned, the export price is 3 cents. There was a huge debate about that report, and export price were 3 cents. People were debating in Quebec, how can we export at 3 cents a kilowatt hour? At the same exact time that there was that debate, Hydro-Quebec was exporting, and Brookfield Power was exporting in New York at an average price in New York for 2 months, average all hours included, of 9.6 cents per kilowatt hour, $96 per megawatt hour. That was the New York market price for energy, short-term contract, a spot contract. You think that's high? Look at New England. For 2 months, the average price in New England was $160 per megawatt hour, the average price. So Hydro-Quebec was selling on average for every hour at 16 cents per kilowatt hour. That was while the debate for the 3 cents was going on in Quebec, and people were saying, why are we building wind? What are we building La Romaine when we export at 3 cents? Look, we export at 16 cents on average. Of course, that was due to the cold weather in New England. That won't last, but after the cold weather, you get warm weather. And we all know that heat waves are hitting the US and Canada. And, I'm not a weather forecaster, but if there was a heat wave this summer in the States, and if people were turning on their air conditioning, I wouldn't be surprised. And if they turn on their air conditioning, then they need gas to fuel their natural gas power plant, and the price of natural gas will rise again. It's already, the current natural gas price is already $1, about $1 above the forecasted, the National Energy Board, the forecast that was released by the National Energy Board in November. So I could be as wrong as any forecaster, but thinking that natural gas prices will stay low forever, I think is a mistake. Which gives you the perspective that Quebec will think a little bit more about the US markets for export than the Ontario market for export. So that is an issue for those of us who want some Canadian integration. Eyes in Quebec are mostly inward, but when we look abroad or outside the province, we look mostly to the US, especially since we are pretty confident in Quebec, or at least I am, and I think Brookfield will also be confident that we will be able to sell some renewable energy credits or certificates in the New York market and the New England market, because in these markets, these are RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standards goal. So you see how much renewable energy they want in all of these states, and this is how much they have currently. So if we look at Massachusetts, for example, look at this one. They are aiming at 22% of renewable energy by 2020. That's in 6 years, but they only have 6% renewable energy in their state. How can they triple that in 6 years? In Massachusetts, you don't build windmills like this. You can't, and it's expensive. So Connecticut would also be at the same level. They have 27 goal of renewable energy by 2020. They only produce 4% of renewable energy now. So, of course, they could lower these goals, but they might also change their perspective. So, for example, some people think that the possibility of states loosening their RPS eligibility rules with respect to hydroelectric projects is real, meaning basically that Hydro-Quebec or any hydro producer would be able to sell not only energy to these markets, but the environmental attributes. So that's a new market in addition to the energy market that would make profitable exports to the US. And that's an obstacle, again, of course, for a Quebec-Ontario integration. But that's something that should be in the mind of those interested. What are the prices for these RECs, these renewable energy certificates? It's hard to find real prices because they all differ. There are few secondary markets that have clear market prices for these RECs. But here you see their value per megawatt hour can go as high as $60 per megawatt hour. Of course, it's not all of the RECs and all of the time, but if we could say $15, $20 per megawatt hour for the environmental attributes, that would be realistic. That's actually the price Brookfield Power gets for one of their Quebec projects that they produce hydropower in Quebec. They sell the environmental attributes to New York State at something probably close to $15 per megawatt hour. And of course, there's more than energy and environmental attributes. There's capacity market. There are capacity markets in the U.S., in New York, and in the New York region, New York City. You are basically being paid $20 for the firm capacity you can supply to the market. $20 per megawatt hour. That's 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's the capacity price someone being able to deliver electricity on a firm contract to New York City would get. You think that's crazy, that's impossible? Well, there are projects currently being planned and almost starting construction. These are 3 projects directly connecting Quebec to New York City. That's the one on the left-hand side. So this one, the Champlain-Hudson Power Express. That would go directly from Quebec to the heart of New York City, and they could get these $20 per megawatt hour capacity price. They could, not now, but maybe in the future, they will also be able to sell renewable attributes. And then there are more projects, the New England Clean Power projects that could supply Vermont 1,000 megawatts of direct current high voltage line. Vermont is closing their nuclear power plant. They have a 600 megawatt nuclear power plant that is being shut down this year in 2014. They will have to think of replacement. They are thinking of Hydro-Quebec for replacement. And there's a third project that is more controversial, may not be happened, but it's also a big one, 1,200 megawatt to New Hampshire. So there are transmission projects going on. They're all privately funded. They're all merchant projects. It can happen without the support of government. So I was saying that we could count on the support of the federal government for Ontario, Quebec, but there might be a business case. Of course, if you want this business case, we need to all change the way we regulate and organize our electricity markets. So the way forward, I think I'm taking a little bit more time than I should. But so these are the generic benefits of electricity market integration. This is what basically it's recognized all over the world. This is not me. It's a lot of people are mentioning that. Integrating market, this is all obvious, you know, but if for electricity separatists that we all are in Canada and in the US, it seems that it doesn't make sense to all of us. So it's good to bring these items up to the policy discussion because there are a lot of benefits in market integration in electricity. I won't go through all of them, but basically it makes more sense to trade, to put power plants where they're the cheapest to be made, to have a common price so that you avoid the irrationality that we have in high consumption in Quebec and high price in Ontario, so you can improve the economic efficiency of the sector by a lot of ways in terms of reliability, in terms of name it, you have more than this. How do we proceed, you know, to how can we build coherence when we have a history of chaos in Canada in terms of electricity markets? It's not easy, and I fully acknowledge. I've been working, and I'm really happy this year. It seems that, you know, I can make these talks and have people to listen. But, you know, a few years ago, when I was still a PhD student, I was, you know, still already talking about these things, and I was all excited about the Finland and Nordic country experience. People were telling me, stop work on that, Pierre, because, you know, no, it's politically infeasible and, you know, nobody's interested. Which is actually, I'm very lucky because then I can publish on these things and no one is interested and I can get papers out of that. As an academic, you know, it's important to get papers. And I also love to talk to audiences that seem interested. So, you know, as Mark mentioned, I'm the only one in Quebec that would be able to say such things. I'm not because I'm happy to be the only one, but currently there are few people that would be able to talk about these topics. We have to think about the Canadian energy framework. And this message is actually coming from Alberta. Alberta is desperate to get some Canadian energy framework. So why don't Quebec and Ontario say, yes, let's develop a Canadian energy framework, but not only for pipelines, but for electricity, for greenhouse gases, and that would be a real energy framework. So that would make sense. If you want to sell your pipeline projects to export your oil sands towards Ontario and Quebec to the east, then, you know, put on the table more than just pipelines and oil sands. Put electricity on the table. Put greenhouse gases on the table. And that's where there is some leverage to negotiate. Quebec currently is implementing its carbon market, and we are deeply alone in this endeavor. We have California as our partner, and having Ontario would be the greatest thing that could happen to Quebec, to the Quebec cap and trade greenhouse gases market. That's how Ontario can negotiate a long-term contract with Quebec. You go and if the next premier in Ontario is convinced that, you know, investing in nuclear is a waste of money, then go to Quebec, talk to Philippe Couillard, which 2 days ago said again that he was going forward with his cap and trade market for greenhouse gases, and put on the table, Ontario will join the cap and trade market, but we sign a contract for hydroelectricity. That would be a first step. I think it's politically realistic. I think that's the only way Quebec can survive with its cap and trade market, is having Ontario as a partner and as a member of the WCI, which is not a Quebec initiative, but in Quebec it's presented as a Quebec initiative, but it's actually a Western climate initiative. So that's how there could be a Quebec-Ontario deal. Of course, the goal would have to be a Canadian deal. But you know, you have to work by steps and start with more shorter items. I will end by saying we need to explain, engage people, educate. The public has to be educated a lot on these issues. They don't like prices, but prices are good. They send right signals. Not saying that the tariffs are well or set. We would need to work on tariffs and the right tariff signals, but there would be a lot of education to do if we want to have these projects politically acceptable. If you want to read some of my papers, there's a list here. I would be happy to send them to you if you wish. If you want to read one that is more pleasant to read, it's not an academic paper. This one is on the website. It's by an unknown think tank in Quebec called the Federal Idea, but they like whatever can integrate Canadian provinces, and electricity, I think, is the best bet for Canadian integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear. We will, with the permission of the presenters, we'll get the slide decks along with the list of papers up on the SEI website. And it's not an entirely lonely endeavor. I had a paper in the Journal of Environmental Law and Practice last year, which more or less said the same thing about how to engage Ontario and Quebec in the national energy conversation, was that precisely it has to be about more than pipelines. It has to be around climate change. It has to be around electricity. There has to be an upside for other parts of the country if they're going to engage in that conversation with the federal government and Alberta. Our third speaker is Jack Burkham, who is the Senior Vice President, Commercial Development for Brookfield Energy Marketing, and in that capacity is responsible for optimizing revenues from Brookfield's fleet of electricity generating stations across North America. Jack.
Thanks very much, Mark, and I'll do my best to keep up with those two great starting panelists. One of my coworkers in Quebec actually emailed me this morning and said Pierre has a opinion piece in La Presse today, actually making a lot of the same arguments I think that you probably just made here today. So for those of you who want to practice your French, go look up that opinion piece. It's a great honor to be invited here, Mark, to speak at the York University Sustainable Energy Initiative. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think it's probably thanks to one of my co-panelists, Jack Gibbons, that I got the opportunity. Jack was at one of the IESO Stakeholder Advisory Committee annual meetings where I'm a member of the IESO SAC, and I was talking about a lot of the same issues I'm going to talk to today, although maybe not in as much detail there. It's always nice to go to conferences where there's panels with people that vehemently disagree with one another, and so maybe we'll get some of that in the Q&A, but I'll probably be singing largely from the same songbook as far as our message that I try to get across today. We think that at Brookfield it's a great opportunity today and going forward for the province to look to import clean energy on the existing infrastructure that the province has. From our perspective, the province is seriously at risk of being short capacity in the near future. The contingencies built into the plan to address that are quite uncertain for us. And again, as Mark stated in his opening comments, there's over 6,000 megawatts of existing intertie capacity that ratepayers have paid for that can be used to deliver these products. Boilerplate. So Brookfield, I won't spend a lot of time on the parent company. For a lot of people in Toronto, they probably recognize Brookfield. We own a number of buildings here in Toronto and all over the world. On the renewable power side, we've got 6,000 megawatts, over 6,000 megawatts of renewable generating capacity. I think the one thing that makes our company unique is it's largely a hydro renewable platform, as opposed to some of the other companies that are more perhaps wind and solar based. In Ontario, we've got around 1,300 megawatts of renewable generating capacity, 400 megawatts of wind that we've constructed in the last 8 years, and 900 megawatts of hydro that was purchased when the market originally deregulated. In line with the title of today's session, Ontario, Quebec, and opportunities for electricity trade, I wanted to highlight our Quebec facilities that you can see up along the border between Quebec and Ontario. These are great facilities. We've got around 300 megawatts of capacity, 1.7 terawatt hours of generation, and nowhere near the storage capacity of our friends at Hydro-Quebec, but we've got around 600 gigawatt hours of meaningful storage on those facilities. Of that capacity, around 250 megawatts is available to be imported into the province of Ontario. Today we deliver all of that electricity into mostly New England, a little bit into New York. But one of the things that I would say as a highlight of those facilities is they're directly connected via 115 kV and recently refurbished 230 kV lines directly into the constrained Ottawa region of the provincial grid. And so if the province was to look to move forward with a contracting regime, we think these are great assets. There's no siting issues. There's no cost overrun issues. These are facilities that could be delivering electricity in Ontario later this afternoon. And I'll just back up. I didn't highlight New York, which maybe I should have, but in New York we've got 700 megawatts of low impact hydro in the state that would be available to sell power into Ontario, and that's around 3 terawatt hours of generation. So I think Jack and Pierre mentioned somewhere in 10 to 15 terawatt hour annual energy that's available today in Quebec. If you look at Brookfield's assets, again, we're a much smaller hydro producer than HQ, but we've got probably close to 5 terawatt hours of hydro capacity, non-emitting generation that would be available for long-term contracting. So I will go through a few slides where I'll try to give our perspective on the supply stack in Ontario and the way we see it shaping up. So on this slide, I've pulled some charts from NERC, and NERC is, for those who might not know NERC, it's the North American reliability entity that manages reliability for all of the continent. And so when I look at the top chart, I apologize, it's a bit busy, but you can see Ontario, I've highlighted there, looks to have the tightest outlook for reserve margins in all of North America. There's 3 lines, and so the third line is what they call the adjusted potential resources, and then the first 2 lines are what are the more real resources. And the difference between those are what NERC refers to, and obviously they're a conservative body, rightly so, as the conceptual resources. So there's a heck of a lot of conceptual resources that Ontario needs to develop to meet our reserve requirements. And so the question that we ask is, will all of these conceptual resources be built and we'll be able to get to a point where we've got a reliable grid? This table I pulled from the November long-term energy plan. And so it's a good chart, and it shows the supply stack going forward and our needs. And so if everything works out perfectly, we've got a plan that's predicated upon a lot of nuclear refurbishment, conservation, and then something that's called planned flexibility, which is the light purple area in here, which I'm not sure what that means. And so to me, even if the conservation and the nuclear refurb works out as planned, there still is a shortfall. Looking at the nuclear refurb, nuclear capacity and generation are clearly, they are, and they will be going forward a critical component of supply in this province. But the scope of the refurbishment is unprecedented. So you look here, there's 10 units that we currently have planned to refurbish. That's 8,500 megawatts. If that plan goes 100% according to schedule, we're likely still short. What happens if we don't execute on scope, schedule, and budget? And as Jack mentioned, the history, not just in Ontario, but in North America, is not great. I would have a lot of confidence in the people in the nuclear industry in this province, but that is a big ask, I would say. And so again, it just leads us to ask the question, what's the contingency planning? So we all think that this is a great opportunity to deliver clean imports into the province. So it's reliable, it's available, it can help with reliability, but cost is really important. So I've got a graph here that has data that I've pulled from the Ontario Power Authority. So this is from their modules supporting, I believe, the assumptions behind the long-term energy plan. The OPA produced real resource costs. So what we've done is just adjusted them for inflation to provide nominal prices going forward. So with the exception of hydro, which maybe to Pierre's point is more of an OPG cost of service type of rate, the major technology supply sources that we're going to rely on going forward have cost somewhere between $100 and $200 a megawatt hour. I've obviously excluded solar, which is over twice biomass and shouldn't rightly serve as a precedent for any contract we would look to do for long-term clean energy imports. I don't know the cost to refurbish nuclear plants. I'm not a nuclear engineer, but, and again, Jack alluded to this, can we do it for $83? You know, nominally it gets to $100 pretty quickly. The experts we talk to say that those numbers don't look realistic to them. So again, I'm not sure what the right number is, but the prices look like they're between $100 and $200 a megawatt hour for what we've already committed to or plan to commit to. And so the question is, will Hydro-Quebec, Brookfield, other people, can we be competitive with those prices? I certainly think we can. But I would ask, why wouldn't the province go out with an RFP and find out? Let Brookfield compete with Hydro-Quebec, whoever else can look to bring in products, and see if we're competitive with what is in the plan today. This map I took from the IESO. It's a geographic map that shows the interconnections with all of our neighboring jurisdictions, and so we've got an extremely robust grid through Ontario, and we also have a lot of very robust interconnections. I've taken the summer import capacities and summed them up to 6,308 megawatts. So the actual simultaneous import limit would likely be less than this, and I think it's encouraging that the IESO is actually looking at trying to understand how they can evaluate that going forward. But in the gross, that's a big number. Ratepayers in the province have largely paid for that infrastructure, and so when we look at that infrastructure, we see broadly three products that can be delivered across that infrastructure: short-term energy balancing, and then capacity and long-term clean energy contracts. And so today, we only use that infrastructure for short-term energy balancing. The IESO does a fantastic job at that, and I don't think there's any blood left to squeeze from that stone. But on capacity and long-term contracts, in particular for clean energy, we don't use that infrastructure at all, in that we are unique across most of North America. And so we would look at that and equate that to building a 1,000 megawatt CCGT in Toronto and only using it to balance wind, but not to provide any capacity or energy. The combined 6,000 megawatts is roughly a quarter of our total peak demand. And so when we ask why would we want to look to bring in clean energy imports on that infrastructure that ratepayers have paid for, I would flip the question around and say, why wouldn't we want to look to do that? So that's sort of an overview of, I guess, our perspective on some of the supply questions in the province and the contingency questions, as well as the infrastructure. The next few slides, I'll try to just frame up some of the activities we see in neighboring jurisdictions that would provide competition for Ontario as far as looking to procure some of these resources that are available. On a green power, from a green power perspective, and I'll talk a little bit about our view of the brown power market. So probably the largest initiative from a public policy standpoint that we see today is in New England. The 6 New England states have come together under an entity called NESCO, the New England States Committee on Electricity. And to cut to the chase, what they're looking to do this year is to issue an RFP for between 1,200 and 3,600 megawatts of incremental clean energy, largely hydro power, from Canada and New York to be delivered into New England. The drivers for this initiative, and there's a lot of consensus around this, the drivers are, I guess, threefold. Renewable portfolio standards, which Pierre alluded to. The states are significantly short against their targets. Carbon. Massachusetts, in particular, one of the largest states in New England, has carbon legislation on their books that binds them to very aggressive carbon reduction targets. And then last is just the brown power market, where capacity, the most recent capacity auction for New England cleared at $15 a kilowatt month, where Brookfield, Hydro-Quebec, other sources sold capacity into that market at those levels. Gas pipelines are constrained into the region, so energy prices are now trading on an annual average basis for the year at $60 in that range. And then because they're short against their renewable portfolio standard targets. The price for the environmental attributes, which isn't actually something that's priced out today in Ontario, but is in a lot of U.S. jurisdictions, is trading at the cap of $60 a megawatt hour. So when you combine those merchant pieces, green power is already trading north of $130 a megawatt hour in New England. And so it's not a huge leap to say, should we fund new transmission infrastructure to access power from Quebec, Newfoundland maybe, and New York. This slide shows a number of the transmission lines that are proposed or being discussed, or many of them, frankly, are already in the transmission queue. Pierre mentioned a couple of them. These lines, many of these lines have millions of dollars of development spend into them already. So this is, I would say, not just a Brookfield perspective that this is likely to go ahead. There are huge private equity companies, Hydro-Quebec, independent transmission companies that are funding millions of dollars into these lines to deliver hydropower from New York and Canada into New England. And so I guess we would ask, from a competition standpoint, isn't Ontario better placed to buy this same output without having to go and spend the billions of dollars to build these new transmission lines to access the same resources? Brown power, I'll try to go quickly. I could do a whole deck on our view of what's happening in the brown power markets, but from our perspective, we're coming out of roughly a decade of extremely sluggish, oversupplied markets, not just Ontario, but a lot of jurisdictions, overbuilt capacity. The economy, had a terrible recession, and loads did even worse than GDP during that period. Our perspective is we're coming out of that period now. A lot of plants in the United States are retiring because the merchant revenues haven't been sufficient to carry their going forward costs. The EPA, Ontario is not the only place that's looking to close down coal. The EPA continues to be extremely aggressive against coal plants. And so we're seeing a lot of coal plant closures in the United States. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has also been quite aggressive recently in preventing loads and states from bringing in new infrastructure, dropping it into the markets, and crushing wholesale prices for the remaining merchant participants. And so as capacity markets come down, and again, we saw recently the New England clear at $15, as capacity margins come down, by design, heat rates go up. By definition, heat rates go up. When heat rates go up, energy prices go up. So we see capacity prices going higher. We see energy prices going higher. There's a lot of gas, as we've talked about, in Marcellus, and it looks like it's cheap and readily available for the next 20 years. But we're also, as a region, not just Ontario, but broadly across the East, really leveraging ourselves aggressively to that one commodity and fuel source. And so we see that there'll be upward pressure on the price of the fuel, but not just on the average price, volatility, which people don't like. We had a lot of volatility. Pierre mentioned some of the pricing we saw this winter. It was good for Brookfield, but we see that volatility continuing and growing going forward as we pull out coal and in the U.S. pull out nukes and increasingly lever ourselves to gas. One other interesting point that I would note is on nuclear, while here in Ontario we want to refurbish 8,500 end-of-life nuclear facilities, in the U.S., again, we talked about Vermont Yankee closing down. That's an Entergy facility. Governor Cuomo is hell-bent on shutting down Entergy's 2,000-megawatt Indian Point facility. This is a great nuclear plant. Why they would want to shut it down when it provides such low-cost power and such reliability to the grid? It's 50 miles north of New York City, and there's significant headway to have that facility shut down. And so I don't think its asset life looks great going forward. So that's just an overview, I guess, of the brown power market. So when we combine what we see in the brown power market with some of the initiatives discussed in New England, the power markets have been deregulated for 15 years. We think of them as being babies, effectively. But in that period, they've been very cyclical. And so, oddly or not, you see across broad swaths of electric geography, we all are short and we all are long at the same time. And when we go short, people are jumping over each other to try to sign contracts because we all end up short at the same time. And so that's what we see happening. And so I don't think Ontario needs to do something today, but I think if Ontario thinks, well, we can wait and take our time and in 3 years, all of these resources will be around, I'm not sure we would agree with that, because I think people will look to start contracting, and the assets that they'll want to contract with first are the non-emitting, the hydro generation. If you can get that at roughly the same cost as what you want to look to build a new CCGT for, that makes a lot of sense. So that's the majority of my presentation. Just a couple slides here on capacity to actually enable these transactions. The province can't do it today because we don't have certain rules in place. Again, it's really encouraging the IESO is looking at how we can do that. Just some tables that show neighboring jurisdictions, these transactions, they're very common. They are a small percentage of the total peak loads in those jurisdictions, but they're probably some of the most reliable, least cost transactions that we see. And so there's that. And then this is just a list of a number of the places where Brookfield has moved capacity. We're very active. So this is something that, while it hasn't been common in this province, is really common. We do it across from New York and New England down through PJM right down into the southeast. So that's it. And we think this is a story that largely should tell itself. Obviously, we haven't done a good enough job of telling the story because nothing much has happened. But it seems like a really straightforward, logical story to us and for the province. And so while not much has happened until recently, we are modestly encouraged. I've got a few quotes here from some recent documentation. One is the first one's pulled from the long-term energy plan in November, where they opened the door for clean energy imports, which is great. And then since then, a couple of directives or letters to the OPA and the IESO to ask them to look in, how do we enable this? How can we do this? And so, we're encouraged that the discourse will continue in this direction, and we'll be able to make some progress this year and next. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much. We've run a little bit over time, but all three presentations were very, very content dense. And so I thought it worthwhile to get what all three speakers had to say on the table. This leaves us with about 45 minutes for question and answer. I do need some technical assistance from the Osgood people with the tablet for the people who are viewing us virtually, just to get back to the email input. But in the meantime, if there are questions in the room, the floor is open. Yeah, Ralph.
Unless I missed it, nobody mentioned any issues around technical constraints on integration of Ontario and Quebec. I wondered, has that problem gone away, or is that not still a limitation right now without significant investment in how much power can be imported into Ontario from Quebec? Referring to the fact that grids aren't synchronized.
I'll take a shot at. I'll start, maybe Pierre. The most recent line that was developed between the two provinces obviously had interconnection studies done on both sides that would take that into account, the delivery capabilities. And so I think that for some of the older lines, they might have to review the import capacity, but certainly for the new largest line, in the neighborhood of 1,500 megawatts, it was just studied and when it went into operation a couple of years ago, so I think it wouldn't be an issue.
I'm talking about the problem of synchronization.
Yeah, that already occurs today. So it's Quebec has transformers that we do transactions on those interties daily, and so Quebec is buying from Ontario at night. They're not generally selling into Ontario because they have better market access in.
But the provinces delivering power has to isolate that generation in order to export it, do they not?
No, it's managed at the interconnections, and I'm not exactly sure the nature of the specific, if they're HVDC back-to-back converters or what they are, but it's not an issue.
privately funded nuclear would be more in the range of 42 cents a kilowatt hour. So I guess the question I have is clearly the numbers are wildly different from what we hear in Ontario from OPG, and there's a considerably different number between the OPG number that was on the earlier slide. I'm not sure if that's the first line up here. But there was a number that was about 70% difference between the two Ontario prices, and those prices are just completely a different planet from the prices that California is seeing. And admittedly, they have different labor laws, et cetera, so maybe higher compliance standards, higher regulations. Feels like, but maybe you give some sort of commentary in terms of like that band of costs, because that is everything in this discussion.
Maybe I can mention that Hydro-Quebec the government decided not to refurbish the only nuclear plant in Quebec, and Hydro-Quebec released a study stating that the cost for refurbishment of Gentilly 2 was 12 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's in between what we heard, and that's an estimate Hydro-Quebec made for its own refurbishment at 12 cents. And it's the same technology. The Quebec plant is similar to, or mostly similar to, the Ontario power plant. So maybe that is a good estimate, knowing that all these estimates are always the lower end of the forecast.
Yeah, and I would maybe add, it's a difficult question, but I think the numbers that are out there, I don't think there's a lot of credible experts that say you can do it for $83 a megawatt hour. I apologize, I think in dollars per megawatt hour. Tennessee Valley Authority is in the process of finally bringing their Watts Bar facility into commercial operation. It should happen next year. So this is the first new nuclear plant. They started it 40 years ago, I guess, and they stopped. And so this will be the first new nuclear plant in the United States in 30, since 3 Mile Island. And so TVA obviously is a federal government entity, so they have free money. And my understanding, it's not very easy to get numbers there, but I think those numbers look more like $120 a megawatt hour, closer to what Pierre said, and that's U.S. dollars. So we've got a Canadian dollar that's at a discount. And I know maybe there's some government capital in the province, but I don't think it's probably as cheap as federal U.S. capital. So again, the price can't be lower than what we know it to be announced today. It certainly only has one way to go.
Well, part of the reason, I guess, is focus on this, a lot of the renewable technologies are sort of on the borderline with sort of the upper range or the mid-range of where it was estimated, but if we look at that to be 5 or 7 cents higher, then there's a tidal wave of renewables that could be doing the substitution here in Ontario or in Quebec. So it opens up a whole range of policy choices. But if the alternative is the market here in Ontario is to produce at 5 cents, 6 cents, or 7 cents kilowatt hour Hydro-Quebec, then it obviates the need for any of that new renewable build out. So that nuclear cost is a big piece of the big difference.
It is.
Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead, Chair.
Yeah, if I could just add, OPG's cost estimate is not credible, and we know they've got a track record. They deliberately, since the 1950s, underestimated nuclear to gain political support from the Premier of Ontario to go ahead, but they never keep their promises. They always go massively over budget, and the people of Ontario are now onto them. They know those estimates are not credible. The long-term energy plan says we're committed to nuclear power, but they actually haven't made a final decision on the Darlington rebuild. The final decision won't be till the first quarter of 2016. And the OPG cost estimate is not credible for many reasons. One, their track record, and also, they're assuming their cost estimate of $83 a megawatt hour is based. This is a $13 billion project, according to them. They're assuming that all their long-term debt will be guaranteed by the province of Ontario, and they're assuming that all the equity financing will be provided by the province of Ontario. And Ontario just can't afford that. if Premier Wynne gets reelected, she wants to invest in transportation infrastructure. And she's not going to be able to do that and also provide a blank check to OPG. If Tim Hudak wins, he said he's going to privatize OPG. And the private sector is not going to offer to build a nuclear power plant for a fixed price of $83 a megawatt hour. And if Andrea Horwath wins, well, she leads the most anti-nuclear major political party in Ontario. And they're committed to water power from Quebec and energy conservation. So, you know, in one sense, we're formally committed to a massive nuclear rebuild, but I think, you know, a sophisticated political analysis suggests that's just not going to happen.
I mean, clearly, the nuclear refurbishment cost is the crucial variable for Ontario in terms of what makes this rational. I have to admit, we had a piece in energy policy earlier this year where we sort of looked at the range of estimates that are out there with some degree of substantiation, and they ran from the OPG number at the bottom of 8.3 all the way up to 37 cents per kilowatt hour. So there's a huge band of uncertainty, which really sort of propels this conversation, because whether the renewables are rational or Quebec is rational really is a function of what do you think is a more realistic number to work with in that context. We've got a couple of online questions that are coming in from our viewers. This one's from James Meadowcroft, who's actually one of the co-investigators with the Smart Grids Project, and it's for Pierre, which is, if the sale of Quebec power to Ontario is linked to raising electricity prices in Quebec to those neighboring jurisdictions, is it likely to raise strong opposition from Quebec consumers? How do you think this can be sold politically in Quebec?
So it's always, well, it doesn't have to be linked. There is available electricity right now that could be sold to Ontario. But on the long term, if we want to sell more and integrate more, then yes, it would be very good to provide incentives to Quebecers to actually save energy, to have better use of it in other places. And that would have to go through higher prices. It's not an easy sell. Rising electricity prices is not an easy sell. But the government of Quebec is in desperate need of cash, and they don't want to basically raise taxes. People see electricity rates as taxes, but if you tell them you can save energy, and we can, because we use electricity to heat our homes, and homes are not well insulated, so there's a lot of work that can be done to improve the energy efficiency of buildings in Quebec. So basically, electricity consumption can go down, and with the incentives of prices, that will bring more wealth to the province in general. So there could be some assistance for low-income households to make sure that the increase in rates doesn't hurt them. But low-income households use a third of the electricity that high-income households like myself use, and that doesn't make sense, that I pay the amount that I pay for the amount that I use. So it would be actually very cheap to help low-income households, to protect them, and to pay high-income households the price they should pay for their consumption. And actually, these high-income households, they have the means to invest in energy efficiency. So they have the largest houses, they have the largest income, and they can invest in energy efficiency themselves. But they have no financial incentives right now to do. So it's a hard sell, but it's possible, especially given the fiscal situation in Quebec.
Yeah, the back there. Yeah.
I'm going to be elected premier of this province, and you're in my cabinet as the energy minister. What is your number one top recommendation that gives me as a premier? That's absolutely at the top of your agenda as the energy minister, and tell me, as the premier of my cabinet, the number one energy recommendation that each one of you have, in any order.
I would say start a Canadian or at least Quebec-Ontario dialogue on electricity and energy, including greenhouse gases. So start the dialogue. For sure, the situation in Ontario cannot change overnight. So don't try to sell short-term solutions. There aren't any. But start a dialogue, start to put people together, try to involve as many provinces as you can, but work. The Quebec opportunity is, I think, with the cap and trade market. Quebec has isolated itself with that cap and trade market, but we're committed to go forward. And that's a huge leverage for Ontario to negotiate a deal. So that would be start a dialogue on these two issues.
Jack or Jack?
I mean, I'll answer that. It's a good question. I'll answer that consistent with my presentation and I guess the topic on the panel is I would say go out and do what New England's doing and issue an RFP for 20 terawatt hours of renewable generation from adjacent resources and see what comes in. See if it's competitive or not.
If I was the energy minister, I would tell the premier to focus on the actions that can give big reductions in terms of our electricity bills, which are energy conservation in Ontario and water power imports from Quebec.
Another online question, this is from Alexandra Mallet, who's one of our colleagues at Carleton, who is also part of the Smart Grids project. And she's thinking about an area of tension in terms of competing visions around what integration means. So on the one hand, you see Ashler plan movements towards more integration on a large scale, while there's a tension in the other direction that suggests a need for more decentralized generation, transmission, distribution, the community energy planning, smart energy networks of direction at the same time. And so there's sort of one dimension there. And then the other question, too, is, and this comes from work she did in Brazil, that Brazil in particular, very heavily dependent on hydropower, deeply affected by what they called the apagio, the lights out due to droughts in 2000, 2001. It's really a resilience question. So what would you say about those concerned about increasing our dependence on one electricity source, in this case hydro, and increasing integration and therefore increasing vulnerability to extreme events?
So we have the chance in Quebec and mostly in Quebec to have huge storage capacity. Jack already mentioned the storage capacity of Brookfield Power, but Hydro-Quebec has 175 terawatt hour of storage capacity, which is close to the actual Quebec consumption for a single year. So that is a huge storage capacity. It's a huge asset. And all the forecasts, there's a huge team in Quebec, the Uranos group that is looking at climate change impacts on rainfalls for the northeastern region of North America. And basically, the impacts are mostly positive in terms of rainfalls and the availability of water. So given the storage capacity and given that whatever we hear in terms of, or scientists have concluded in terms of availability of water in the future, it's not really a concern. And I think decentralized generation should be promoted. I think that should be promoted by sending better tariff signals to consumers and by making people pay for being connected to the grid. So there should be just a higher connection fee distinct from the energy fee, so that people who actually want to produce their own energy, but while being connected to the grid and benefit for their connection, they actually are benefiting from the system, not paying the full price of their connection. So there should be a connection fee that is actually encouraging distributed generation by having people lower the capacity at which they connect to the grid and pay for the energy. So the two should be more disconnected to encourage distribution generation.
Yeah. Tanya's got the mic, which we're going to ask people to use.
On the
Testing. I'm curious, to the points about investment, I don't have a lot of faith in the government knowing, no offense to people who are, I'm sure a lot of people work very hard at the government. I don't have a lot of faith in them sort of predicting the future. In terms of either long-term investment or where we're going to get our energy from. With regards to innovation, what strikes me is if you guys could comment on, if we look at, I guess, nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, kind of, I guess, the top five or whatever, can you just provide the private market is going to drive a lot of the investment. And to the comments of the gentleman from Brookfield, I think the United States is already showing through capital, private capital and equity, the money will go where they think it's going to offer return. And I remember selling $8,000 mobile phones in the 80s, and the government of Canada was freaking out that the only people that ever be able to own them were well-to-do real estate agents. And we know that, you know, markets change and innovation really drives cost. Can you guys comment on, if you could maybe rank them, where you think in 10 years we might be looking back, or 20 years, and saying, wow, we really missed the boat on wind in saying that the innovation changed the game and it went to 1 cent a kilowatt hour, or nuclear changed the game with version 5 or version 4 of the magical box. Because I sense some, like hydro is obviously a resource that requires water running. Can you just comment on where, if in 15 years you were going to put your money as where innovation will drive out costs, just like the laptop used to be 20 grand and now it's 200?
That's a great question. It's a really good question, because the industry's largely unchanged in 120 years, and it's going through huge changes. I'm not sure it's quite yet equivalent to the telephone model, but you hear that dialogue all over conferences in North America. Brookfield as a company doesn't like to be the first owner of any technology, so I don't know. We'll own it once it's become mainstream, but I think that solar, it looks like prices are continuing to come down at a rate that's pretty astounding, and then the more scale you get, the more that cost pressure comes to bear. I'm not sure there's a lot of fat left to squeeze out of wind generation equipment, but I think on solar, you know, we would expect that prices continue to come down. In jurisdictions like Ontario, where the solar resource isn't great, it still is a pretty high cost, but in places like California and Arizona, it looks like it's competitive with what wholesale markets can deliver today. But from what we look at, the holy grail is batteries. So Tesla's supposedly investing $5 billion in a battery manufacturing facility that they have funding for in Nevada. And so that's the holy grail, and I think that that's probably where in 10 to 15 years we'll look back and say that's, you know, that's the biggest change, should be my guess.
Yeah, I had no idea at the beginning of Jack's answer, but then I thought storage is the answer, but then you mentioned it. I think storage, batteries, but there are different ways of storing energy. Heat can be stored and distributed, used you store during base load to use during peak load. So I think storage is the key to manage the intermittency of many renewable sources. There's a lot of technological development to happen there, and that's needed for implementing smart grids and to make people use the grid in more efficient ways. It's really storage. But before that happens, a lot of change has to happen on the regulatory side to have price signals sent to consumers, especially in jurisdictions like Quebec, where nothing can happen if you have a price as low as 7 cents per kilowatt hour, because no one is interested in doing anything. Even if the technology is there, even if it's all available, regulatory changes are the changes we should work for now, more than technological changes.
It's interesting. Sorry, Jack, you're in.
I agree with what the other panelists have said. I would just also add that I think there's a huge potential for innovation with respect to energy efficiency and also with solar PV.
Question for all three panelists, I'll take my chair's prerogative, is how is the dynamic of this conversation different if we're talking about Quebec as storage to balance intermittent renewables in Ontario versus a straight supply sort of arrangement? I mean, how would the dynamics of the conversation be different?
I'm not totally confident in all the details of the short-term transaction, but as far as I understand, and then maybe Jack will correct me, but all the the trade between Quebec and Ontario have to be settled or have to be closed an hour before the real time. So if you want to do some wind balancing with the Quebec hydro system, then you would have to have more flexibility to have a more 5-minute, 15 minutes window at which you can schedule trade. If you have to close trade an hour before, then the wind situation might change. So as far as I understand, in order to balance wind in Ontario, between Ontario and Quebec, you would need to review deeply the trade mechanisms between and the intertie connections regulation between the two systems. And that's a lot of work because we need to harmonize more how the IESO is working and how Hydro-Québec TransÉnergie is scheduling trade.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's interesting in the context of some of the initiatives and activities that we've seen in the province where they are discussing storage. There's been discussions on how do we do this, is it small scale, is it large scale? And I think it comes back to investment price signals. Storage, large scale storage, like pump storage, for example, traditionally, you buy off-peak power and you sell on-peak power. The price spread today isn't sufficient to incent construction of those resources. And then if you look at getting existing resources to provide those products, the Ontario is sort of a funny market because it's a hybrid structure. The price signals for ancillaries in the province really aren't great, and in a lot of markets they're not great. And I think they need to be a lot higher to get the signals to direct people to invest in infrastructure, whether it's existing or new, to provide that. And places like Harvard are looking at implementing a demand curve for ancillaries, which is a similar construct they have for capacity, which effectively serves to price the product at a much higher level on a continuous basis. So I think that there's not the price signals there today to enable a contract that would get somebody like HQ to say, yeah, I want to do that. If you look today, the IESO has a mandate to go out for, I think it's 35 megawatts of battery storage. So it looks to me like this is sort of a test case. Mm-hmm. But my understanding is those batteries, which have maybe an hour of storage, so it's definitely not a wholesale type of market product, cost in the neighborhood of $2 million a megawatt. And so if you look at Ontario's ancillary services market revenues, you would never be able to build those resources. But they're going to maybe do this. And so is it worth $2 million a megawatt, or is it worth, some fraction of that based on the signals we see today? I think that those services that you would want through a storage contract are better included in a contract for long-term green energy and capacity. And the province can say, okay, HQ, great, we want to do that, but we actually also want your help because we've got a lot of wind. And then you can just include those services into that contract. But on their own, it's hard for me to see how it works.
So it makes more sense to roll it into a supply contract.
I would think,
Jack. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with what Jack said. I mean, Quebec's huge hydro reservoirs are by far our best storage mechanism. We should be exploiting it. If we combine our wind power with hydro's storage reservoirs, we can turn wind from an intermittent, unreliable source of power into a firm, a 24/7 source of baseload power. I mean, again, this is just another huge benefit of integrating our two power systems.
Yep. Oh, Tanya's good. Oh, Peter, thank you. I need my glasses to see.
Yeah, Peter Love here. I'm very interested in, Pierre, your comments about the need for a national energy strategy. And I'm sure you know the Canadian Council of Chief Executives have twice called for this in 2007 and 2012. And they don't talk about, and they're looking to build pipelines as more than anything else, but they talk about conservation, they talk about an energy price, but they're talking about having a national strategy. At a recent event about a month ago, Premier Wynne made reference to the Council of the Federation, which is meets once a year, meeting the premiers, and she mentioned that she was going to try to put it on the agenda. Do you think that would be a useful is that something we can build on as a way to get a discussion of the strategy? Because it does not seem to be happening at the federal level. The National Energy Board seems to be completely unengaged from it, but I think more and more, even the large companies, as I said, Canadian Council of Chief Executives, 150 of the largest CEOs in companies in Canada, are calling for this strategy?
It's definitely something that is raised regularly at that conference of the Federation. I think there are other venues where it's raised. The Internal Trade Agreement of Canada has a whole chapter on energy, which is totally empty. So if you go at the Internal Trade Agreement, it's a big book, but then the energy chapter is blank. So it's crazy to think that, we think of us as a trading country, and we are unable to trade electricity on our own terms. We're unable to agree on trading electricity. So I think negotiations on the internal trade agreement are part of the venues that should be used to promote that. But it's true that the main obstacle is the federal government that doesn't seem to be interested in any kind of Canadian energy strategy. And it's funny when we hear Alberta saying that we need one, and the government is not responsive. I think, whatever event and occasion should be used. And if it doesn't happen in Canada, Quebec is in discussions with the New England governors. So there is actually more integration with New England and Quebec. So that has, I think, to be reversed, because it's not how it should be done. Quebec, there was the best deal for integration that was closest to be reached was between Quebec and New Brunswick. Maybe if you remember, a few years ago, Hydro-Quebec was about to buy New Brunswick Power, but then that fell down because of political reasons. It was badly prepared. All the discussions were hidden, and then suddenly the deal was announced. So we should definitely engage more Canadians before announcing anything, and educate people. But it can be done. It was really close to be done between New Brunswick and Quebec. That would have been exactly the case for integration. And now, because that didn't work, then we see these absurd planning and then transmission lines going from Labrador to Nova Scotia. And that's harming everyone.
A couple of demand side questions for Pierre. In Ontario, one of the things we've experienced is that the demand projections have been consistently off. Indeed, over the past decade, we've had projections that demand will increase, and in fact, it's been declining even once we return to positive GDP growth. And so I wonder, going back to your chart with the supply and demand picture in Quebec, I mean, how reliable is Hydro-Quebec's demand forecast? And is there a history of overprojection as there is in Ontario? Is there a possibility that oversupply gap could actually turn out to be substantially bigger?
Yes, of course. There's a universal history of over-forecasting demand. Every utility has the built-in interest of building more. So yes, every forecast of demand done by utilities is usually over the reality. Can it be less? I don't think so, because it cannot be much less, because residential demand in Quebec is growing, because people don't care, and they are, although we don't get richer at the same rate as other provinces, we still get richer every year in Quebec, and we use more electricity on the residential side. Industries that were the main reason why industrial demand decline in electricity. I think those who had to go, they went, and we will see more investments in different sectors in Quebec. So industrial demand will likely grow, and as residential demand and commercial demand is also growing slowly, I don't see a collapse of demand in Quebec. So there is oversupply, but I don't think it will grow by much.
Very interesting. Further questions? Yeah.
Yes. No. Oh, yes. I just have to talk closer. Sorry. My question is more a political question. In the coal transition and in not being able to compete for FIT contracts, OPG was a loser in the energy transition. And it seems like they would be a loser again if we were to import from Hydro-Quebec. So my question is, what kind of political capital does OPG and the Power Workers Union have? And what kind of job losses would we be looking at if we were to make this transition?
Well, OPG and the Power Workers Union have historically been a very powerful lobby in Ontario. I think their power is waning. And, lobbies can have a lot of power, but ultimately politicians have to do what the voters want. And the voters are very concerned about high electricity bills, and there's going to be incredible pressure on whoever is the next Premier of Ontario to take real measures to reduce bills, not just some of these gimmicks that are being promoted by some politicians. And therefore, I think, the Darlington rebuild will not proceed. The Pickering plant is going to be shut down by 2020 at the latest. So I think what we're going to see is that within the next decade or so, Ontario Power Generation will revert to its roots, which is a great hydroelectric company. And so I think, in about a decade, OPG will own Niagara Falls and the St. Lawrence generating station and numerous other generating stations in Ontario. And then it can be renamed Ontario Hydro. And I think that is the future, the best future for OPG.
Further online questions. This is from Maya Jagan, who's another colleague in the Smart Grids project at UQAM in Montreal. And she's asking, Pierre Olivier mentioned that there are no incentives for insulating houses in Quebec. How about Ontario? Have higher standards been adopted in the building sector, amendments to construction codes, or the subsidies for energy conservation?
Well, yes, there are. We have made a lot of progress in Ontario. The building code has been strengthened greatly. Most of our energy consumption for buildings is natural gas, and the gas utilities do have conservation programs, which are very cost effective. Premier Wynne has adopted a conservation first framework for natural gas, which means that the natural gas utilities are now obliged to invest in all cost-effective conservation options before investing in new supply. And this implies the need for a huge expansion of the gas conservation programs, which will hopefully fund home energy retrofit programs. Premier Wynne and Andrea Horvath have both endorsed financing programs for home energy retrofits. The financing could be low-interest loans on your utility bill. So, yes, I think there's potential to make huge progress in that area in the next few years.
It's a very interesting cultural divide. The CDM piece in Ontario has become relatively embedded, whereas in Quebec, the conversation hasn't started very much yet. So further comments and questions? Yeah. Okay.
I know Quebec's been spending a lot of money since 2000 on conservation. Of course, the cost effectiveness of conservation in Quebec, because electricity is cheap, makes it, we cannot say there's nothing. That's
okay, fair enough. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think the mic's just behind you.
I'm not sure if I need the mic, but Andrew March with Pierce Power. This is another question for Pierre. Could you speak a little bit more to just getting back to the politics of trying to make this happen in Quebec, about the economic trade-offs that are available if you get people to conserve energy, and that energy can then be sold at a higher price in the export markets? So there's revenue on that side, but there's costs associated with trying to implement the energy efficiency measures. Could you talk about the two sides of the equation there, and how much money is prospectively available to export markets versus how much it's going to cost to free up that extra power from consumers?
So for every cent of increase in the Quebec rate, you get about $1.6 billion of additional profit. So if Quebec rate, which is 7 cents, was going to 10 cents, which would be, for example, my personal proposal, the Quebec government would get Hydro-Quebec would get in profit $4.5 billion in additional profit. And then these $4.5 billion, so they would be directly coming to the Hydro-Quebec's bank account, and which basically is owned by the government, so that money could go either as a dividend to the government. And my proposal, to make sure it's politically feasible, I would to convince people, send checks to all Quebecers over 18. So that would be equitable in the sense that there's a huge inequity now in Quebec because the hydro force, which is at the basis of hydropower, the hydraulic force, is actually owned by the government. But who is actually using the hydraulic force? It's those who can use electricity. It's the richest people. So the hydraulic force is not allocated equally among all Quebecers. It's those with the richest, who are the richest, who have the largest homes. So now my proposal will actually increase efficiency by you raise price, send a check, and then people, if they want to still pay the 10 cents and keep their consumption high, then they can basically reuse the money for that. But people are usually brighter, and then or they could be brighter. Let's say not usually, but they can be brighter, and they may invest in energy efficiency, and they would first start to use their electronic thermostat, which some people have, like myself. I'm not using it because I have no incentive to use it.
Right. Rather than talking about how you would use price increases, I'm trying to drive at, if you free up power at the same cost, you can sell that at a higher price in an export market. That is available if you implement some energy efficiency measures.
Yes.
And those measures have a cost.
No, these measures, the way we thought about energy efficiency has a cost because we think utilities have to fund that. But and as it's been mentioned, Hydro-Quebec is wasting $200 million a year on energy efficiency. When I don't think it's job to do it, people should take that. So what I'm saying is, you just scrap the energy efficiency programs. Hydro-Quebec is funding. Provide information to people. Yes, people should be informed, and there should be more information to tell people what they can do. Help different businesses to provide the improvement they can provide. But once they face the price, people should be intelligent enough to see the price, look at the information, and invest themselves, not have the utility invest half of the price to do that, and have free riders do this, and then so.
For the last couple of questions, one here.
So in Ontario, we have the FIT and the microfit program, in which the provincial government's incentivizing private companies as well as individuals to connect to the grid, sell their own renewables back. Whereas in Quebec, as you mentioned, there's a connection fee to actually connect to Hydro-Quebec and sell back to the grid. So will the shift in, say, Quebec lowering their surplus by supplying Ontario change the way it's done in Quebec? And why is it the case that this is happening in Quebec right now?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So if I was going to produce my own energy on my roof in Quebec and I wanted to sell that back to the grid, am I incentivized to do that by Hydro-Quebec, or will I have to pay a fee to actually connect into you?
No, currently, the feed-in tariff Hydro-Quebec is providing is the exact rate at which Hydro-Quebec is selling. So if there are probably 10 to 20 persons in Quebec that have installed small PV panels on their roof, and Hydro-Quebec is rewarding them by paying 7 cents per kilowatt hour. They can only deduct that from their bill. So they cannot the way they sell is by lowering their own consumption, and Hydro-Quebec is paying them just the avoided cost. That's the only incentive.
Further questions? Yeah, one more down here. Oh, we'll just wait for the microphone. Yeah. Diana's just bringing the microphone. Yeah.
We've been talking a lot about what could be possible future developments. There's certain areas of the United States where fracking has destroyed the potable water production. What if fracking turns out to be, as some people think, to be a disaster? What will that do to our whole discussion about energy?
I think for our discussion, it would be great in terms of it would only promote more integration and because natural gas is not a key. Well, it's important in Ontario, in Quebec for electricity production. In Quebec, it's almost non-existent. But then the value of hydropower is lower because of the overabundance of natural gas. So if the price of natural gas increases, then all of our discussions actually become extremely more relevant because there is an additional incentive to talk and cooperate and trade.
I was thinking more of the United States, where this is Obama's wild card, Trump card, about everything, is what now that they don't need to worry about Canadian oil or anything else because they've got so much plentiful gas.
Yeah, it's a huge. It's probably the biggest driver in the U.S. economy right now, and so from an economic standpoint, it's been great for them. There's obviously some environmental questions, but I think in regards to our discussion, it makes sense at $5 gas. So obviously, it would make sense at $10 gas prices. You know, from our perspective, there's gas that's accessible in the United States today at a cost that is much lower than the costs that we've been pulling gas out of the ground in North America for the last 10 years. But whether fracking gets overruled or not, I think our perspective would be in the long run that it's not sustainable, sort of back to some of Pierre's slides, it's not sustainable for gas to trade at $4 or $5 in the United States and at $10 to $15 in the rest of the world. What will close that gap? There's a lot of variables that could close it, but I think our perspective would be in the long run, unless shale is fracked everywhere in the world and the global price comes down to $5, what's more likely to happen is the U.S. price is going to go higher regardless of what happens with fracking regulations.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's likely to both potentially be environmental constraints. There's also huge pressures in the United States to be able to export gas, precisely to be able to access the world price for the fracked gas. So either way, the price is likely to go up relative to where it is, which is going to make hydro assets, the sort of conversation we're having here, all the more attractive economically.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing manufacturing come back to the United States at an unprecedented rate. So you either export the commodity or the demand comes back to you.
Which again would push the price back up.
Yeah.
Further questions? Last question? Peter, yeah.
Just a last question on, I'd say, one of the economic development topic that was raised by the OPG question earlier, which is one of the reasons we have the most provincialist power system in the world is the government see it as their responsibility to encourage economic development. And Mark, you touched on it a bit with the storage question, which is now we have a government that's pushing Ontario develop storage to develop Ontario technology. A few years ago it was green energy, and of course more traditionally it's been nuclear. When you produce power, when you encourage investment in other jurisdictions in power and then sell it to us, you lose the jobs. And that's certainly been a focus of the politicians. So I'm just wondering how you're going to convince politicians in Ontario that to move to a system where, you know, storage services or new energy supply is being sourced elsewhere, that's a good move for Ontario.
It's a good question. Jack?
Well, I guess this idea in Ontario that developing our own generation sources is a great way to create jobs. I mean, that was once true. At the beginning of the last century, when we had huge untapped hydroelectric resources, Sir Adam Beck correctly saw that by developing these hydroelectric resources, we could stimulate the economy, build a great manufacturing sector in southern Ontario, create the golden horseshoe. And he was right. We developed Ontario Hydro, and we developed all our low-cost hydroelectric resources. And as a result, for the first 50 years of the last century, our electricity rates continually declined as we developed more and more hydroelectric resources, and we got economies of scale. So that it was true once that developing made in Ontario or focusing on made in Ontario generation made economic sense. But the world has changed, and you know there was this belief that nuclear would be too cheap to meter, and therefore developing the CANDU energy system would be a tool for economic development. But it's turned out not to be true. The CANDU nuclear technology is the worst nuclear technology in the world. We haven't had export sales for decades, and so what was once true that the electricity sector is a great source for job creation, it's no longer true. We've got very high electricity rates due to our dependence on high cost and unreliable nuclear, And in the future, if we actually want to make Ontario's economy more competitive, we have to reduce electricity bills. And the way to do that is energy conservation and water power from Quebec. And I think, the politicians are finally realizing it. I mean, it's been half a century since we tapped out our low-cost water power, but they're finally realizing it. Premier Wynne has adopted a conservation-first strategy, which says do all the cost-effective conservation before a new supply. I mean, this is just common sense, but it's revolutionary. We've never done that in Ontario. And then also, in her long-term energy plan in December, Premier Wynne says, we will do a long-term deal with Quebec if it's good for Ontario ratepayers. So I think we're actually seeing just a profound shift in our energy policy over the last year. And it reflects the fact that, electricity rates are very high. It's a huge political issue. There's a political consensus now that we've got to bend the cost curve. And the way to do that is conservation. It's water power imports from Quebec. And that's what will help make Ontario once more a prosperous member of Confederation.
So you can add slightly. Quebec used to produce cars, and I'm happy to say that now, we lost all the jobs and we have no car industry in Quebec. And that's a good thing for the Quebec economy because we don't have to pay these companies to stay in Quebec and keep the jobs in Quebec. So if you have to pay companies to or pay too much for the product, it's better. You're better off just losing the jobs and putting your money in places where are actually productive.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think, Peter, that's a really good question. Certainly, energy policy has had a big industrial component to it for a long time in the province. And I think, as I indicated on my last slide, the jury's still out, actually. What will happen? Nothing has happened to date. We're relatively insular in the way we look at these opportunities. And will it change? I don't know. I think it does come down to price. So at some point, as price moves up and up and up and up, I think that probably becomes the trigger that gets people to make different decisions that might have different economic outcomes. I think that's probably the trigger. If the government is able to do a lot of things to create jobs inside of Ontario and the price doesn't move, then there's probably not a ton of appetite to change what's been happening. But I think we are seeing prices go higher, so I think that, that likely becomes the impetus maybe for saying, all right, well, let's look at something else. And I think that would be the point that Brookfield would make, is the interties are up to 25% of the total peak capacity. And if you look at the simultaneous ability to import, it would be less than that. So let's call it 3,000 megawatts. I'm pulling that number out of the air, Peter. But it's a small percentage of what the total needs are. So the province still has the requirement to do a lot of things inside of Ontario. They still have a ton of hard, difficult choices regarding steel in the ground in the province. None of this obviates the need to actually have capacity in Ontario, and what the government wants to do to build that capacity, really, it's a political question. What I would say is, if you look at doing some of these intertie transactions, they'll save you money. Was it $1 billion? Is it $10 billion? Is it $30 billion? It's to be determined, but it's a lot of money. And then, it's to Pierre's point. What do you do with that money? You just give it back to ratepayers through lower rates? Maybe you take it and invest it in some other projects that, for public policy reasons, you think make a lot of sense. But it will lower your rates. And so I think that's what we would say, is it makes sense, even if you still want to do things for industrial reasons inside the province.
It becomes less about the electricity sector as the centerpiece of a strategy per se, and more about the relationship between energy costs and the rest of the economy. It still leaves open possibilities for particular sectoral developments, but it becomes less of a centerpiece than it has been historically, which was that the electricity policy was industrial policy, as in terms of developing the sector itself, as opposed to the relationship to the wider economy. I mean, I think that's the answer we're getting, basically. But it's a very good question, because it runs up against, the province has moved in other directions, both historically and more recently, and the problem has been that once we were out of hydro, what we discovered is that we're not necessarily that much better about doing all the other technologies than other people. And so it gets much, much tougher to sort of capture market and to establish competitive advantage around particular technologies. It's probably going to be more of a niche and specific component as opposed to a large-scale strategy. Exactly what happened with nuclear is other people figured out how to build plants too and seem to be able to do it better and cheaper. So that's where we ended up. On that somewhat happy note, or unhappy note, depending on how you look at it, I want to thank all three speakers. I mean, this has been a very, very informative morning, very, very helpful, and hopefully there were the right people were watching by webcast too, and we'll see a rise in the level of the political conversation in the province over the next couple of weeks about energy issues as well. So thank you very much. A couple of people were asking, we had a number of the SEI publications out on the table at the back. Just a reminder that those are available through our website as PDF downloads if people want to have a look at those, along with a number of working papers and other documents from the initiative. But thank you very much.